Hi everyone, for this lesson we are going to be discussing subtracting fractions. We're going to be going over some key facts that we need to remember and then also doing some practice problems. Now before we begin, let's also remember what LCD represents, which is your least common denominator. Because remember, when adding or subtracting fractions, you have to have a common denominator. And identifying the least common denominator helps in not making you simplify so much at the end. So here for our example of 3/8 minus 1/5, notice my denominators are not the same. Using the least common denominator, I have to list the multiples for both 8 and 5 up until I identify what the least common denominator would be for these two, and that would be 40. So this is one option that you can use when adding or subtracting fractions. I'm going to show you a little bit different way, just that I feel is a bit easier. So when subtracting fractions, again, most important thing is to identify your common denominator. One way is using LCD. Again, I tweaked it a little bit. Instead of listing all the multiples, I just looked at the first denominator and I'm multiplying the second fraction by that number. And then vice versa. I looked at the denominator and I'm multiplying the first fraction by that number. Because remember, what you do to the bottom, you got to do to the top. So this is one option we can use. Option 2 is using butterfly, where you crisscross to identify your numerators that you will be subtracting, and then multiply the two denominators to get your common denominator. From here, you subtract your numerators, and then keep the denominator. Now, when can this be used? Well, there's different ways it can be used in real life, but one way I'm going back to is when baking. If you have a certain amount of flour and say you're going to use 1/2 cup for cookies, 3/4 of a cup to make a cake, 4/5 of a cup to make some cupcakes, and you want to know how much you'll have left just in case you may need to go buy more. Again, we would have to learn how to subtract fractions. Is this the only example? No, there's others, but it's just one I wanted to share with you. So now let's look at some practice problems. Here you have 3/8 and we're subtracting 1/5. Notice how our denominators are not the same. So we're going to do both options. Option 1 is LCD, just where I tweaked it a little bit. And all I'm going to do is multiply each denominator by the other. And what you do to the bottom, you do to the top. So 5 times 3 gives me 15. 5 times 8 gives me 40. Now I'm going to do the same thing for my second fraction, except this time I'm multiplying 5 by 8, the opposite denominator, and what I do to the bottom, I do to the top. 1 times 8 gives me 8, and then 5 times 8 gives me 40. Notice how your denominators are the same now. So all you have to do is subtract your numerators and keep your denominator. 15 minus 8 leaves me with 7 out of 40. 7 is a prime number and it's not a factor of 40, so this lets me know that I do not have to simplify. Now, let's say you prefer butterfly. We can use the same problem to use that strategy. And I'm going to cross multiply. 3 times 5 gives me 15. 8 times 1 gives me 8. And then 8 times 5 gives me 40. So notice how what we have on the left-hand side and then here on the right are basically the same thing. The only difference is on the left-hand side, we're showing step by step what we're multiplying together, and on the right, we're just crisscrossing and circling it. But once you subtract 15 minus 8, you'll still get 7 out of 40. The same answer we got using option 1. For our next example, it states Chloe has 7 cups of flour and will use half a cup for the cookies she is baking. How much flour will she have left? Okay, she has 7/8 and she's going to use 1/2. Notice our denominators are not the same. So option 1, multiply each denominator by the other. And what you do to the bottom, you do to the top. So 2 times 7 gives me 14. 2 times 8 gives me 16. Now for our second fraction, I'm going to multiply 2 times 8. And what I do to the bottom, I do to the top. 1 times 8 gives me 8. 2 times 8 gives me 16. From here, notice our denominators are the same. So I'm going to subtract, my numerators are the same. So I'm going to subtract my numerators and keep my denominator. 14 minus 8 gives me 6. And then my denominator of 16. From here, notice you have 2 even numbers. So we can simplify because both of them are divisible by 2. So 6 divided by 2 gives me 3. 16 divided by 2 gives me 8. This gives me my answer that she is going to have 3/8 of a cup left. Now again, you can also do butterfly using the same 2 fractions. 7 times 2 is 14. 8 times 1 is 8. And then 8 times 2 gives me 16. Notice how this looks the same as this. So 14 minus 8 leaves us with 6 out of 16, which we have already simplified, giving us the same answer of 3/8 of a cup. So just as a review, whenever you're subtracting, if you have a common denominator, you keep that denominator and you just subtract the numerators and simplify if needed. Now, if your denominators are not the same, you have your options. Do I want to use LCD or do I want to use butterfly?